You wake up, start your computer, and open the Epic Games Store. Unreal Tournament is the biggest esport in the world. VR is still a niche technology, and Half-Life never happened. Sounds strange? Well, that's because Half-Life is one of the most important games ever made. It proved that FPS games can have a story, laid the groundwork for Counter-Strike, and was the reason Valve grew as a company, which made Steam possible. So let's find out what would have happened if Valve never made Half-Life, because the industry would have been very different. First of all, there are a few things that could have prevented Half-Life from happening. You see, Valve was struggling to find a publisher for the game. They were a new company and wanted to make something that hadn't been done before. It was a financial risk, so most publishers didn't want the trouble. So let's say Valve never found a publisher and Half-Life never happened. Let's start with the most obvious consequences. Before Half-Life, most first-person shooters were pretty simple. You had a lot of guns, a lot of ammo, and a lot of enemies in front of you to shoot. A good example is Doom. It's a classic run-and-gun game. Fast movement, hordes of enemies, and tons of guns. And Half-Life changed that. It introduced a cohesive story to the FPS genre. Friendly NPCs made the world feel real. They talked directly to you, and it told its story through the environment, the kind of environmental storytelling that influenced future games like BioShock, Dead Space, Metro, and Dishonored. Half-Life 2 and its episodes became the benchmark for in-game physics. Every object had weight. You could launch a box into an enemy and it would break and damage that enemy. On top of that, Half-Life 2's animations were ahead of their time. Subtle facial expressions, eye contact, and body language. All of that made the characters feel real. That set a very high standard for future games once again. But if Half-Life never happened, most FPS games would have continued to follow the old formula. As John Carmack said, story in a game is like a story in a movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. That would have been the motto of most FPS games. If you want to see how a modern version of that formula would look no further than Doom 2016, Serious Sam 4, and Ultra Kill. They are genuinely good games and a perfect example of how the FPS genre would have looked in general. Speaking of FPS, Half-Life laid the groundwork for Counter-Strike, which would go on to change esports. It was made possible because Valve included amazing modding tools with their game. At first, it was a small mod developed by Min Lee and Jess Cliff. They weren't trying to redefine the genre, but they wanted something different from games like Quake. In June 1999, the Counter-Strike beta was released, and it was an instant hit. Anyone who owned Half-Life could play the new mod. Community feedback shaped the next version. Maps like DE Dust, DE Nuke, and CS Assault were made by the community and became legendary. In the year 2000, Valve noticed the small team and hired them to turn the mod into a standalone game. But in this timeline, Half-Life never happened, meaning Counter-Strike also never happened. So what did happen? There were a few games that could have easily taken the place of Counter-Strike. Quake 3 was one of them. Just like Counter-Strike, Quake had an extremely high skill ceiling, required you to master the mechanics, and was already huge in the early days of esports. However, it was mostly one-on-one or for small teams. It was too complicated for casual gamers like you and I, and it was hard to watch from the sidelines. Then there was Rainbow Six. It was similar to Counter-Strike because it also was a round-based game with real-world weapons, but it also had a slower, more methodical pacing that required you to plan out your actions. Its complex UI and lack of accessibility for a broader audience make it an unlikely candidate as well. And finally, there was Unreal Tournament. It had team-based modes, a strong LAN community, and was easier than Quake. Regardless of what game would have taken the place of Counter-Strike, competitive FPS would have stayed arena-focused, rather than becoming a balanced tactical experience. But let's say Unreal Tournament became the new Counter-Strike, and that's where it gets interesting. If I tell you to launch any game that you own, you will go ahead and open Steam. But Steam doesn't exist in this timeline. So what do you open? The Epic Games Store. Let's unpack a little bit here because it sounds like a huge leap. Since Unreal Tournament took the place of Counter-Strike, it became the industry standard for competitive esports. That kind of industry pressure would force Epic Games to spend a lot of time improving their game and increasing their market share. Since Steam never existed, they would become the leading online store simply due to the sheer popularity of Unreal Tournament. On top of that, they wouldn't develop Fortnite, or at the very least, it wouldn't be their top priority, because they would already have a successful global hit. In our real-life timeline, Epic Games is focused on Unreal Engine. It's one of their main products. But in this timeline, since Unreal Tournament is a global hit, they don't have many reasons to develop Unreal Engine for mass use. For example, we wouldn't have a video game called Body Count. It relies heavily on photorealism that was made possible with the power of Unreal Engine. You could argue that it could have been made with Unity, but it would have been way harder to do that. Still, Epic could have focused on Unreal Engine, but with Unreal Tournament already bringing in steady income and no real pressure from Unity, there wouldn't be much reason to do so. so. This means that a lot of indie games that used to go on itch.io and other platforms would have either never been made or would have been made with Unity. Speaking of Unity, since it doesn't have any serious competition, it becomes the most used video game engine in the world. Most indie games that we know today would have been made using Unity 3D, but you probably wouldn't even know they existed. You see, since Epic took the place of Valve and started focusing on Unreal Tournament rather than the engine, it's unlikely that their online store would have accepted random indie games. That means that indie games would lose a lot of publicity and marketing opportunities, allowing AAA projects to dominate and bend the rules of the market even more. Innovation would move slower, and innovation is important everywhere because stagnation is deadly, regardless of the industry. Take VR for example. Before Valve released Half-Life Alyx, most of the games were either short or straight-up tech demos. Movement was awkward, interaction was minimal, and there were few actually good games. It had its own fans, sure, but it was a small market. However, when Valve released Half-Life Alyx, everything changed. They showed that this technology had legs. The game had everything: physical reloading, interaction with the world in a natural way, and movement that actually felt good. On top of that, Half-Life Alyx felt like an actual experience, something that most other games could only dream about. But since Valve didn't release even the first game in the series, what would have happened to VR? Honestly, it wouldn't be dead, but it would be smaller and more niche. You see, at the time, VR didn't have any flagship titles, and even if Half-Life Alyx didn't make everyone buy a headset, it did prove that VR had quote-unquote real games. Boneworks and BoneLab would become the reference points instead of Half-Life Alyx. Boneworks, released in 2019, would become the benchmark for any VR game, which would make the technology even more hardcore and niche. Comfort and accessibility would likely have been an afterthought. But most importantly, without Half-Life Alyx, other major companies would have been unlikely to try making VR games. It's a financial risk, and when you have Unreal Tournament 54, why would you risk something that isn't even proven to be financially viable? As a result, even in 2026, VR technology would have been seen as something fun, but also something that's still waiting for its half-life. Honestly, this alternative timeline is pretty fun to imagine. A universe where people watch the Unreal Tournament International, buy games on the Epic Games Store, treat VR as a fun but experimental thing, and most shooters still follow the old formula of run and gun. I'm not saying that this is exactly how it would go, but hey, it's fun to think about. Anyway, thank you for watching this video, subscribe to the channel for future alternative timelines, and I'll see you in the next episode.